Okay, so welcome to everyone in the room and on Zoom. This is the 6th seminar in the Aphasia CRE seminar series and our first seminar for 2020. I'm Sarah Wallace and I'm from the University of Queensland. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Jagera people as traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the CRE Aphasia, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. We are very pleased to have presenting today Professor David Copland, one of our chief investigators within the Aphasia CRE from the University of Queensland.
What's the password, Norm?
I'll cover some housekeeping to begin. And please be patient with us and the technology today. We are gathering many attendees via Zoom links. Our apologies in advance if there are any disruptions to your viewing during the seminar. Occasionally, attendees join in late via Zoom and there may be some background noise. So to enhance everyone's Zoom experience, please mute your microphone, turn off your video and minimise the Zoom gallery. Thank you. So this seminar is being recorded on Zoom and will be available to access as a webinar video with playback via the website. Just click on the resources tab. Videos are usually uploaded 1 to 2 weeks after each seminar. All previous seminars have been uploaded to view thus far. Questions for this seminar will be aided by the use of Slido. So you can log in anonymously or with your name and you will be able to see all questions put forward by the other audience members. It's a great way to engage with the presentation experience and allows you to ask questions online so you can concentrate on the presentation. Our event code is 2509. You can enter your question under the questions tab at any time. And if you'd like someone else's question, click the thumbs up button and this will show us the most burning of questions and David will answer as many questions as time will allow. Also, please consider any feedback you might have and you can enter this info under the Slido app under the polls tab. One other request is that we're just trying to gather some information on the numbers of people watching at each site. So if you are joining us from a site where there are a number of people, could you please answer the question on Slido about group size? And of course, please feel free to engage with us on social media via Twitter and Facebook. And you can tweet along today and use the hashtag AphasiaCRE. And so I am delighted to introduce Professor David Copland from the University of Queensland. David is Chief Investigator for the CRE. He leads research program number 1, Neurobiological and Psychosocial Predictors of Recovery. He is a Principal Research Fellow and Speech Pathologist conducting research in the areas of language neuroscience, psycholinguistics and neuroimaging of normal and disordered language. He is also Director of the newly funded Queensland Aphasia Rehabilitation Centre and Group Leader at the UQ Centre for Clinical Research in the Language Neuroscience Laboratory. Today, David will discuss research relating to the CRE program that he leads. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. And thanks very much to the CRE for the opportunity to speak with you today. So today I'm going to be talking briefly about some of the work that the CRE is doing relating to predictors of aphasia recovery. But I'll be primarily talking about some neurobiological principles of aphasia recovery that there's been a lot of interest in whether we can apply particular principles from animal models of neuroplasticity and recovery for improving aphasia rehabilitation. So when we think of aphasia, often its foundations are actually in this interface between the brain and and behaviour. So it was founded on this notion that you actually get a lesion in a particular region of the brain that is associated with a clinical symptom. So these clinical anatomical correlations led to the idea that you can classify people with aphasia, and this is still a dominant paradigm. However, when we think about how we treat people with aphasia, often this rehabilitation occurs without consideration of the brain. So this is in terms of where the lesion is, what residual language networks are intact, and what the potential for neuroplasticity is. So we've been primarily based, when we think about treatment, in this realm of behaviour. However, at the same time, there are models of stroke recovery that have been developed primarily based on animal recovery to insult, and this allows measurement at the neuronal or molecular level. And it's at a level that is not possible currently, often, to record in live humans. But what has emerged from these models are principles of neuroplasticity. And in more recent times, it's been suggested that these can be used as guiding principles for improving aphasia outcomes. However, sometimes these principles are actually in direct contradiction to other models of normal human learning. So when we think about how humans learn, there are clearly aspects or mechanisms that are relevant to what we're doing in aphasia treatment if we consider it as a form of relearning. So when we think about these principles, there's been an increased interest over the last 20 years, but the clinical implications are still unclear. So overall, a neurobiological approach to aphasia might improve our ability to accurately predict who recovers and what type of treatment response they might make. It may allow for new treatments, so this includes pharmacotherapy or non-invasive brain stimulation. And it might also tell us something about how we might modify our current treatments in terms of when we should be giving them and how we should be giving them. Plus, it's also important to understand then how treatments work. And this can then allow us to improve the effectiveness of the treatments. So why might this be important? So one of the key reasons for this is that we've been getting some challenging findings regarding long-term outcomes. So the Cochrane review of Marion Brady found that while there were significant benefits for aphasia therapy, the benefits were not evident at follow-up. And so this means we should actually then be reconsidering what are the critical ingredients in aphasia therapy trials that we're running and aphasia practice. So we need to change something, because this should be our ultimate goal, is improvements that are enduring. The Brady-Cochrane review gave us some hints as to directions that we should be following, and this includes the observation that therapy given at a higher intensity or higher dose or over a longer period appears to be more beneficial. So these are the two overall questions. As I mentioned, I'll only be briefly talking about predictors of recovery, but this is one of the key questions that we don't have good answers for at the moment. So when someone presents with aphasia, will they recover, to what extent, and how quickly? And one of the key problems for the field is that a measure simply of severity at onset does not give us full information about recovery potential. So for certain patients, the factors that are driving recovery are different to those that are responsible for the initial severity. So getting a measure of the person's behaviour or symptom severity at onset will not then provide full indication of how every individual will recover. And so that's also in the motor domain, but when we come to aphasia, things are even more complicated in terms of how the person presents, and then what their actual recovery is over time. So aphasia recovery is highly variable, difficult to predict, and the estimates of complete recovery are up to 50%. So people have looked at all sorts of predictors, but often these will account for only up to 41% of variability in recovery. So there are some better estimates, but often this is the type of amount of variance that we can account for. So this means that there are things missing, things that we're not measuring that are driving recovery. So within the CRE for aphasia in program 1, what we're interested in is whether information around the person's demographics and premorbid function, an estimate of their brain health prior to stroke, and then information about the stroke, the lesion site and size, can help us improve determining what the outcome is for someone with aphasia and whether they will improve in response to treatment. So I won't be going through this today, but within the CRE, we're looking at different measures of imaging that may improve our ability to predict recovery. So this includes getting estimates of language networks by getting people with aphasia to be doing functional MRI tasks, and then looking at the relationship between activity within these language networks and their capacity to respond. Also looking at activity within more domain general systems and whether that may drive recovery of aphasia, but also considering psychosocial factors, both as a predictor of recovery and considering it as an outcome. And so, again, all of these factors may change over time, but what we're keen to do over the course of the CRE is to develop an idea of what might be the best combination of information that we can use to then get accurate predictors that can be used at the individual level. And just briefly, so one of the most promising approaches to this is the PLORAS database. So this is a database led by Kathy Price at UCL, and it is a relational database. So what it involves is that you could end up with an individual's scan plus their behaviour and demographic information. That is then fed into this database, and it uses a similarity-based search. So what it's doing is looking at other people already in the database to see whether we can then provide an individual recovery trajectory of where this person will end up in terms of recovery. And so this is a really exciting approach, which there's now over 1,000 patients in this database, and it's able to accurately predict for those individuals who are followed up. So this is an example of speech production based on the CAT, where the prediction and actual score is tightly related. So it's accounting for a lot of variance. So it shows the promise of this approach. However, just as one example, this approach does not currently consider therapy. So we're keen to, and this is part of the plan within the CRE, is to then see whether with the addition of therapy, it actually changes these recovery trajectories. So that's ongoing work as part of the CRE. So that's within the neurobiological and psychosocial predictors of recovery, where what we're wanting to do is to determine the clinical utility of some of these approaches to improving our ability to predict outcome and treatment responsiveness. So the other aspect that may enable us to improve outcomes is to use these guiding principles of neuroplasticity. And so we've been looking at this in terms of a couple of principles in particular. And here I'm just going to focus on two key principles that relate to intensity and repetition or dose. So it's important to note here that these are also just general treatment factors that we need to consider regardless of the underlying neurobiology or neuroplasticity. So how much should we be, how much therapy does an individual require, and how should we schedule or deliver this therapy? And there's evidence from animal modelling that these principles are based on, which suggests that repetition, so the amount of repetition and the intensity of stimulation actually drives plasticity and behavioural recovery. And then in this instance, it is long-term potentiation, which is this increase in synaptic strength that occurs and underlies long-term learning and memory. So the idea is that you need sufficient stimulation intensity to drive this improved long-term potentiation. And that this needs to occur over a significant amount of time for it to have a long-lasting effect. So these are studies that are based on animal models of particular behaviours. When we think clinically about intensity, there are many different ways to measure this and to measure dose, but I'm just going to talk today about considering when we have a particular amount of treatment hours that we can provide, what's the duration of that treatment that we should be using? And so these are the different ways we can think about cumulative intensity or the total amount, how distributed these sessions are. So should they be massed or distributed over time? How long should sessions be, and the overall duration? And there's limited consensus around what high intensity aphasia therapy is. So this ranges from 5 to 20 hours a week, but often the standard practice might be 1 to 2 hours a week, depending on the stage of recovery. But we have some recommendations that aphasia rehab should be of a high intensity. So this is clearly important clinically, because if we have a limited number of hours that we can provide therapy, should we be distributing it spaced out over time or massed in high intensity? And the evidence for this is unclear. So the most recent analysis review by treatn and others found that there was no longer a benefit for high intensity therapy compared to lower intensity therapy. And the Cochrane review of Brady's found that there was some evidence that functional communication would be significantly better with high intensity compared to low intensity therapy. So when we look at the studies that have been used to provide this overall finding, however, we observe that the majority of the high intensity therapy trials, in the high intensity dose, they're actually getting a lot more therapy overall. So intensity is being confounded in a way with dose. So when we look at high intensity versus low intensity, we're actually looking at high dose versus low dose in most studies that have been used in this particular review. In those that are matched for dose, so they're just looking at high and low intensity, so should it be spread out or massed? They're very small numbers and actually comparing different therapies. So it's hard to then draw any conclusions. And for the one study that did provide a similar amount and the same treatment, there was actually no difference for high and low intensity therapy. So we have this principle of neuroplasticity that suggests that therapy might need to be intense, but at the same time, within human learning and what we know about how we acquire new skills, we have a distributed practice effect. So this is the idea that if you're going to learn a new skill, rather than massed practice, so this might be learning how to play golf, if that was of interest to you, or learn a new language, that actually you get benefits when you might spread out exposures over time. And so if you have a given amount of study time, you should actually distribute presentations over time, and this actually gives you better long-term consolidation and maintenance memory. And this includes things like learning new words. So we know this is relevant to aphasia treatment in people with aphasia. The relationship between how well they learn new words, it is correlated with treatment response. So we've got these two opposing ideas around whether therapy should be intense or distributed. And we have a lot of studies where they haven't controlled for the amount of treatment at small numbers, or they haven't controlled for the amount of dose. So this is the PhD work of Jade Dignam's, where Jade controlled for the amount of therapy and then looked at it over 3 or 8 weeks. So it ended up being, for pragmatic reasons, a competition between New South Wales and Queensland. And so it was LIFT, so language impairment and functional therapy, versus D-LIFT, which is distributed LIFT. So that's over the 8 weeks. And what this involved was 48 hours, so either 5 days a week or 3 to 4 days per week. And it's a comprehensive program that tackles impairment, functional skills, uses computer-based approaches, and also includes group work. And this group work includes aphasia education and support and conversation training. So what we observed when we've controlled for the amount of therapy is that actually, counter to the principle of neuroplasticity, you get an improvement. You get an improvement in both arms, pre to post therapy, when you're looking at naming, but you actually get more of an advantage when therapy is distributed over 8 weeks compared to 3 weeks. However, there's no difference when we look at performance, proxy-rated functional communication on the SETI, and also communication-related quality of life on the assessment for living with aphasia, which we wouldn't have predicted either. So the implications are there's no clear benefits for intensive therapy over a more distributed version. And I need to say here that I wouldn't call the distributed LIFT a low intensity treatment, but it's less than the high version. But we still need to consider then there might be benefits for sometimes spacing out therapy. And this might also have other advantages for making things more feasible and accessible for people to do one of these treatments. We also found no significant dropouts at this chronic stage post-stroke in the high intensity group. So this has some implications clinically in terms of not always thinking that the therapy that we provide needs to be provided in a massed way. We also need to note that the dose or the overall amount of therapy provided is actually significantly more than often is able to be provided in usual care. So why might this be the case? We've been looking at, so there's theories around distributed training that enables greater opportunities for mental rehearsal between sessions. So you might get deeper processing. You might get applications of strategies that we were employing in the treatment, that the person with aphasia then gets to apply these strategies in between sessions. There's also a theory that high intensity practice induces what's termed reactive impedance. This is a fancy way of saying people get bored after doing many, many hours of therapy. So there's a mental fatigue. There's also problems with attention over time. And we know that attentional problems are very common in people with aphasia. So this is something we need to keep in mind. So there's, interestingly, some complementary work by Stahl and others, which has suggested that there might be diminishing returns after therapy is of a certain amount per day. So they looked at 2 versus 4 hours a day, And what they observed was that overall there was an advantage for therapy that was provided in 2 hours a day, and you didn't get the same advantage when it was actually provided for 4 hours. So there might be some, and this is particularly for maintenance and follow-up, where you get an advantage for the 2 hour a day therapy arm compared to 4 hours. So this means we need to rethink and carefully consider how many hours a day an individual is receiving in therapy and how we distribute this over time. So the next related principle to this is the dose or the amount of therapy. And clearly this is not to freak people out, but a very small amount of anything does not harm you. But it also probably doesn't do you any good either. And so when we think about therapy, often we are in the middle of a conundrum where we're unable to provide a sufficient dose. So when we look at total dose, we know that larger treatment effects are observed with more therapy. We get better outcomes overall. And the analysis of Bogle and others suggested that it was around 98 hours of therapy where you would find a positive effect. So there's a very tight correlation between the length of therapy and the outcome. But we know that this is significantly greater than what is currently able to be delivered from a number of studies. And so this is both clinically and also in the trials that we're running. There are often much less therapy that we are providing. So clearly dose will be something where it isn't one size fits all. It's most likely that for every individual, there will be a particular dose of therapy that is required. But one suggestion based on these reviews is that for almost all of our trials, we are not providing sufficient therapy. And this might end up explaining why we get null results or no long-term benefits. So, in response to this notion that our current practice and our current trials are very much not giving sufficient amount of therapy, we have a number of potential responses. So the first is that we just accept clinically we can't provide that amount of therapy. So we have limited resources and we just can't do it. And that's it, which is a rather depressing end. However, the second way that we can address this issue is we think about targeting or redistributing current therapy resources. So if we have a certain pool of resources, how do we distribute those resources? So when they're in short supply, then there's this very difficult ethical decision of you either provide therapeutic levels of intervention to some individuals or provide subtherapeutic levels to all. This is probably a decision that most of us would want to avoid doing. And it's also, in order to do this, you would need accurate clinical predictors and evidence from large high-dose trials identifying what is the therapeutic amount required for long-lasting benefits. So we actually don't have this information. So this isn't really an option at this point. So often, given these challenges around high dose and these questions, there's often this tension between considering what direction we should take, and this is both within research trials and clinical practice, between what's pragmatic and realistic and what may need to be done to improve outcomes. So taking on these big challenges. And at times, I've personally been concerned that where we've developed treatments which, such as the LIFT program, where you're giving 50 hours of therapy, where it's like we've built a Rolls Royce. It might work, but it's impractical and impossible to implement given the dose. Now I've slowly come to the realization that actually this Rolls-Royce analogy is incredibly offensive. If you think of the fact that maybe people with aphasia do need 100 hours of treatment in order to live successfully, and then that's not a luxury, but it's actually a basic need, and we need to, as a profession, find ways to actually deliver this. So it's more like your standard car, somewhat less luxurious, but a necessity. So we then need to think about a change in the approach to aphasia trials, given this lack of evidence and the fact that it's possibly this low dose that explains the lack of effects. So at this point, rather than being pragmatic and only testing treatments in their current forms or doses, we then need to think about ways to conduct future trials of aphasia treatment that need to be more aspirational. So they need to test the impact of high dose treatment on outcomes. And through this, we can drive improved outcomes in terms of living successfully with aphasia. So this is one of the key focuses for the CRE in aphasia. And interestingly, this aspirational approach has had success in other areas of stroke. So for instance, when thrombolysis and clot retrieval were first developed, there was a lot of resistance and backlash in terms of this just not being practical, in terms of all of the obstacles that were required in order for it to be implemented. But this type of aspirational approach is now being promoted more broadly in terms of neurorehab. And it's one thing that I think we might need to move towards. So the third option then is to find new ways to deliver high-dose treatment. So this is to run some of these high-dose trials to build an evidence-based around what is required. So what's the necessary amount of therapy that people need, and then to advocate for people with aphasia to receive this requirement. To think about things like self-management as another way to develop ways to deliver sufficient therapy, computer-based service delivery options, involvement of volunteers and communication support teams. So there's a number of ways we can be creative around achieving this particular dose. And it's interesting in the realm of upper limb rehab post-stroke, Nick Ward has been developing a high-dose treatment at University College London clinic. And this is upper limb movement improvement. So this is a line of no change. And this is after patients got 90 hours of upper limb rehab. So every dot above the line is an improvement. We don't have data like this on people with aphasia, but I would hazard a guess that if we look at our current way that we deliver small doses, we would not have this many people above the line. Whereas what we need to consider and explore is whether actually dose is the critical factor that is leading to this highly variable outcomes. The really exciting part of this treatment also is that improvements continued following discharge. So after the treatment, when people are discharged, they're continuing to make improvements. And within limb rehab, there's this idea that this actually reflects the fact that if you get enough trials and enough of a dose of treatment, it can then enable other neuroplastic principles, such as use-dependent plasticity and generalization and transfer, that you get increased spontaneous use. So clearly things are different when we're thinking about aphasia and spontaneous use, spontaneous communication and what that requires. But the principle here is that there's a threshold above which you might get this increase. Once you get an increase in spontaneous use, this will in turn improve performance. Improved performance will then further increase spontaneous use. So there's the potential there that we have, if we give a sufficient dose, we will get into this virtuous cycle where we get improvements improved activity and participation, which leads to more improvement. It may be that in future trials we can then think, how do we measure when a person with aphasia is at this threshold? So they're starting to use their communication spontaneously. And do we need to keep going until they get at that point, wait, see if they are doing that, and have this as a cyclical method for clinical trials? One of the other issues when we think about dose and delivering potentially 100 hours as one figure is that it's really not fun. So the way that we've conceived therapy at present is often incredibly boring. And we often overlook that. So we don't think of, would this be enjoyable for someone? Or would it be challenging enough or engaging enough? So this is something, if we're going to think about high dose trials, we need to then engage the person's intrinsic motivation is one way to think of this. So intrinsic motivation is this idea that we all do these things. So adults with a reasonable work-life balance spend some amount of time doing things like painting pictures, building furniture, playing sports, whittling wood, yes, and doing countless other things for which there are no obvious or appreciable external rewards. So you're doing them for fun. So the rewards are inherent in the activity, but there might be these secondary gains. But the primary motivators are there's this spontaneous internal experience. I've witnessed this in my household where certain people are getting very high doses of Candy Crush and various other applications that appear internally rewarding. So there's a growing science around this idea of intrinsic motivation. And often what we see within this field is that it is for tasks where it's a just manageable challenge, where there's clear goals and there's immediate feedback. And so clear examples are things like crosswords, but this actually then taps into a reward system which is incredibly reinforcing in terms of this behaviour. So it ends up linking in with the dopaminergic system in the striatum, where once you get behaviours that are salient in a motivational way, it increases attention and it increases dopamine release. So when we think of our current therapy tasks, here's an example. So we've been doing work actually imaging people while they do therapy tasks. You get a picture, you're asked a semantic verification. Does it oink? Yes or no? And that's it. And it lights up this bit of the posterior middle temporal gyrus. Or see a picture, hear its name, say it again and again and again. And again, you get some of this temporal activity. If you actually think of different tasks that are still in the realm of language processing, and they are around, in this instance, language learning. So this is an example from some colleagues, Ripoll and others, who developed a language learning task where it was like you had to solve the puzzle in an ongoing way. So every Sunday, the grandmother went to the jardin, and then you had to start thinking, what could that mean? And then you solve it once you see this second part of the puzzle. What happens at that point where you go, aha, it means symmetry, for instance, is you light up this same reward system in the ventral striatum. So it lights up in this incredible way every time you have this successful learning event. And the fascinating thing is this completely overlaps with other non-linguistic rewards. So this is healthy individuals who then did a gambling task where they had rewards for wins versus losses, and you're lighting up the same network with a language processing task that is structured in a way that it is challenging but rewarding if you get it. So this is then something that we need to think about when we're considering the therapy that we provide. There's also evidence in terms of animal models of cortical reorganization, that plasticity is also optimized. If you think of, again, it's this just manageable sweet spot where it's not too hard and it's not too easy. This actually maximizes plasticity and performance. So how do we then achieve this? We need to think again about how we deliver therapy, considering, and you might consider this like a co-design approach to tasks. And this seems very obvious, but we actually ask people with aphasia around what type of activities and tasks they are engaging in that they find intrinsically rewarding and motivating. And there's examples from existing therapies of this. We also consider things like social communicative functions that can be built into things and aspects of gamification. There's a lot of hype, but the idea would be we're using tasks that are then intrinsically motivating and rewarding. Plus, we can use technology to do things like adapt task difficulty online. So we continue with, you can measure performance over time, and you can then use this kind of adaptive approach to keep things in that sweet spot where it is just manageable. It's still a challenge, but it's engaging. So this then feeds into a principle of neuroplasticity where there's been less attention and it's less well developed, and that's around salience. And I suspect this is something we need to be considering more, particularly if we do need to be delivering such a high dose of therapy. This is where we need to consider how much attention is paid to the type of tasks that we're doing. So just paying attention, so this is in the motor realm, but this provides an example of where you get plasticity if you're attending to a particular hand, whereas this is not observed if you're not attending to that hand. So this then raises the question of how do we approach attending to what we're doing within language therapy, for instance. If you get similar driving mechanisms of plasticity, but it needs to be attentionally directed in order to maximize this. And there are already wonderful examples where it's so much more attentionally engaging in the types of therapy that are delivered. So the other way that we can think of some of these principles, particularly around the intensity or the scheduling of therapy, is you can drill down to then the individual item. So how do we space out individual items when we're delivering therapy? So what are the optimal timings of individual learning events? And so this is something that is being hyped a lot. I think it's brain-computer interfaces within this hype cycle. At the moment, here they are, they're peaking at the moment, but this might be the start of the trough of disillusionment. So caution around this aspect of the talk. But there's increasing interest in this idea that you might be able to use brain signals, extract features automatically to then drive, and often this is in terms of driving devices, so there's a lot of emphasis on this at the moment. But in terms of aphasia, what we're now coming to realise is we can actually get brain signals that we can automatically record and analyse that can differentiate between correct and incorrect responses prior to the response being made. So this is where we get to the point of error prediction. So if we can predict errors before they actually occur, then we might be able to intervene to reduce incorrect productions, which is clearly useful, and increase successful retrieval trials. So this then improves this idea if we get long-term improvements. So Tony Angren and others, we've been working on this idea that prior to verbal production, you can actually get EEG signal that determines whether you are going to be correct or not in your naming of a task. And so what we've observed is that you can actually get these event-related dynamics of EEG that are occurring prior to the response, which allow you on an individual trial to work out they're going to make a mistake or they're going to get it correct. So this then has potential because you could potentially be using this to tailor the trial and the timing of particular items. So you present an item, you get EEG, you work out whether they're going to be correct or not. If they're going to be correct, go ahead and name it. If they're not going to be correct, wait. Don't make that production. Actually wait until there is appropriate brain activity, which will then enable you to have a successful production. So this then enables us to get much better at, rather than just providing trials no matter what, we work out brain states that are most optimal for learning, relearning, and then recovery. So this might provide a new way to control the delivery of trials. But we need to be careful around applying these kind of principles of intensity. And it's likely that the principle of intensity will also interact with things like dose and treatment type. So that's the end of my talk, but I'll just very briefly plug the QUARC. So the Queensland Aphasia Rehab Centre is a really exciting opportunity we have where we will be able to trial some of these ideas around high-dose comprehensive aphasia treatments. So it's based on some philanthropic support in addition to a partnership with Metro North Hospital and Health Service, where we are we're looking at service delivery and implementation of comprehensive treatments and other services that we can provide. So in conclusion, we need to be cautious about applying principles of neuroplasticity to aphasia therapy, but we also need to be aspirational about addressing some of these major factors that I consider are influencing aphasia outcomes, and this is particularly around dose. But there's then a reason to be optimistic that with these advances in imaging and predictive models and large trials, we'll then be able to provide clinical predictors that can enable clinicians and people with aphasia to be providing therapy that's required to enable the best outcomes. Okay, I think that's it. There are some selected references there.
So Kelly's going to put up some Slido questions.
Okay, thank you, Kelly.
I can read them.
Okay, so the first question is, it seems that more therapy, It seems that some therapies more easily lend themselves to measuring dose, e.g. naming therapy, easier to control repeated exposures versus conversational therapy. Thoughts? Yes, and so that's probably why we often start at things like naming, because we can measure trials. It's easier to get a handle on exposures and timing of exposures. But you're right, we do need to consider other forms of therapy where it is going to get messier, thinking about what is the dose of conversation. So how do we actually measure it? Is it time? We also need to think about intensity in terms of things like how hard is the task? So there's the next question is there potential to measure intensity or task difficulty in other ways, such as cortical activation, stress hormones, some other measure during language tasks? So that's a great question. So things like stress hormones, like cortisol, would relate to some extent to how difficult or how under stress someone is while performing a task. However, I'm a bit cautious given that there's still questions about how reliable it is in terms of its time course. So you would need to make sure that it was reliable in response to just that trial at just that time or just that block of therapy. And it can be influenced by many other things. So you'd want to make sure that your measure, so there might be potential in the future for some biomarker of task difficulty, but you want to make sure that it's measuring what you think it is rather than other factors. There is, in terms of cortical activation, there are patterns of activity that do reflect task difficulty. So you get particular networks that would be more engaged when a task is more difficult. But that's, again, probably more around understanding different types of therapies rather than identifying in an individual how difficult they would find a particular task. So the next question was, new dose learnings have important implications for clinical decision making around when to discharge and understanding of patient plateau. Yes, so there are major implications, and I think we still have a lot to understand around what a patient plateau really means. Its potential, so there's some evidence from some of the neuroplasticity literature that we need to continue stimulation beyond some kind of behavioural plateau in order for there to be long-lasting neuroplastic changes that then enable long-term gains. And so we are still, I think there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of understanding what a plateau is in behaviour, not just at that point in time, but in terms of long-term effects. So the next one, treatment intensity in the studies you mentioned relates to how frequently treatment is undertaken to different treatment options. Is undertaken to different treatment options based on their predicted recovery, carefully targeting high dose therapy to patients more likely to benefit from it.
I think there are two parts to two different questions.
They are two different questions?
Yes, there's two-part questions. You've got part one from one question and part two from a different question. So the 1 out of 2 that's in brackets was posted at 5:30, 5:23, and the others were at 5:45.
Okay. So for the first one, treatment intensity in the studies mentioned relates to how frequently treatment is undertaken. Is there a second part to that? So that's how, at the moment, that's how we have been looking at intensity. I'm not sure if there's a second part to that or a question relating to that, but I'll have a stab at it anyway. That's only one way to look at intensity, and that's in terms of scheduling. In other fields such as physical therapy, intensity is also considered in terms of task difficulty. So how challenging or how much effort is expended for a person to undertake a particular task. And that's something, again, where we're only beginning to start to think about how we might measure that. So at the top, at what point in the future do you think it becomes feasible for clinicians to integrate neuroimaging knowledge, re-preserved language networks to facilitate treatment? So I'm cautious about putting a year on this, but I think in the last 5 years, things have advanced significantly. There's always a risk that things don't get translated into something that is practical and useful. But I think the model of the Plurus system, where they're currently trialling getting clinical scans and feeding them into a database and then that ends up providing for an individual recovery trajectory. I think that's a model for what might be clinically feasible. However, that's then a structural scan of lesion. What we're interested in also thinking about is whether more advanced imaging, so functional activity and residual networks, whether that is also required to make better predictors. That aspect of imaging, I think, will be longer off in terms of something being clinically able to be implemented. Upper limb research in Auckland, the use. Yes, so in Auckland, the use of an upper limb algorithm has become clinical practice now to establish recovery potential and to allocate patients to different treatment options based on their predicted recovery carefully targeting high-dose therapy to patients more likely to benefit from it. Your thoughts? So yeah, this is a really exciting development so it's the PrEP algorithm, which is a very clever way of using different predictors, but ordering them in what is the most simple and able to be collected easiest first. So you might have a clinical measure of, for instance, in language, it might be clinical measure of language severity. And you might have, after that, it would be a structural scan. And at each point of these predictors, you then are able to dichotomize and predict yes or no, they will respond or they won't, or you need more predictors to be more confident in your allocation. I think in aphasia, we need a lot more data and larger trials in order to provide information about what is reliable in terms of what those predictors are. But in upper limb research, yeah, the PrEP algorithm is a really nice model that it would be great if we could do something similar in aphasia. So in brain signal studies, what is the EEG actually measuring? A particular pattern of brain activity not conducive to accurate recall or patient error awareness. So, great question. We actually don't know at the moment. So what we're currently trialling is to better understand and then get a report on whether the person is aware that they're about to make an error, or the other potential is that there are just certain brain states that are more conducive to optimal learning and performance. And individuals aren't always aware of the fact that they're about to make an error. But you also, within EEG, you can get this error-related negativity that can occur prior to the actual response. So it's probably a bit of both, but we need to carefully tease that apart.
That's all we have.
Okay, apparently that's all we have time for, but thank you very much for all the great questions and thank you for listening.
Okay, so thank you to all of our attendees for your participation and great questions in the seminar today, and thanks to Dave. If you have a moment, we would really appreciate your feedback on this seminar. So please jump onto the Slido app and provide a few comments under the polls tab. So we're looking forward to our next seminar, which will take place on Wednesday, the 26th of February. And our speaker will be Professor Ian Kneebone from the University of Technology in Sydney. And Professor Kneebone will be discussing the topic of optimising mental health for stroke and aphasia. So thank you all again, and that's the end of our seminar.